What would you do if the seat you paid for, the dignity you earned, was stripped away in front of hundreds of strangers just because of how you look? When Dr. Malcolm Harlow, a quiet black engineer in his 60s, boarded Flight 721, he only wanted a peaceful trip in first class. Instead, within minutes, a smiling flight attendant demanded he give up his seat. No reason that made sense, no apology, just a humiliating order to move to the back of the plane. But what no one knew was that Malcolm wasn't just any passenger. He carried within him decades of quiet resilience, a lifetime of expertise and the authority to uncover truths no airline wanted exposed. By the time this flight touched the ground, the skies themselves would never be the same. How could one man's forced walk down an aisle ignite a fire that shook an entire industry? How could a single seat become the stage for justice? Stay with us, because this story will change how you see the world above the clouds. If you believe stories like this must be told, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe, because what happens next is something you'll never forget. Dr. Malcolm Harlow moved with quiet certainty as he stepped into the jet bridge of SkyReach Airlines Flight 721. The evening air from Boston still clung faintly to his navy suit, pressed to a sharp crease, his polished leather shoes reflecting the dim overhead lights. He carried a slender black briefcase under one arm and a boarding pass in the other, printed clearly with his seat. 2A. Malcolm was 62 years old, though his posture carried the discipline of a man who had lived a life defined by structure. He had spent decades building safety systems for airplanes, working behind the scenes in laboratories and conference rooms, speaking rarely but decisively when it mattered. Tonight, he was simply a passenger, another traveler bound for Los Angeles, content to use the long flight to refine the notes for a keynote lecture he would deliver at an aviation ethics conference. The cabin doors opened with a hiss, and Malcolm stepped onto the soft carpet of first class. A hush lingered in the air, the kind unique to the front of the plane, low voices, clinking glasses, the quiet rustle of newspapers. He adjusted his glasses, offering a polite nod to the flight attendant in the galley. She barely acknowledged him, her eyes fixed on a tablet in her hand. That suited Malcolm fine. He never sought attention. He slid into seat 2A, a window seat bathed in the glow of overhead lighting. He stowed his briefcase neatly, powered on his tablet, and began scrolling through slides of graphs and flight data, lines and curves he had memorized but still perfected with care. For the first time all day, he allowed himself to exhale. The flight would be long, but solitude suited him. It lasted less than 3 minutes. "Excuse me, sir." The voice was syrupy sweet, but beneath it ran a steel thread. Malcolm looked up. Standing over him was a woman in her 40s, blonde hair wound tightly into a bun that seemed to pull at the edges of her forehead. Her uniform was impeccable, her smile precise, and her name tag read Clara Jennings. "I'll need to see your boarding pass again," she said. Malcolm blinked, momentarily puzzled, but he complied without question. He offered the slip of paper with his steady hand. Clara glanced at it, her smile tightening, then handed it back. "I'm sorry, sir," she said. "This seat has been reassigned. You'll need to move to another section of the plane." Malcolm raised one eyebrow. "There must be some mistake. This is seat 2A. I booked it weeks ago." "Yes, I see that," Clara replied. "But due to operational adjustments and safety requirements, we've had to reshuffle a few passengers. Your new seat will be much more comfortable for you." Her tone carried the weight of finality. It was not a request. It was a command dressed in civility. "Where exactly have I been reassigned?" Malcolm asked evenly. "Seat 34E," Clara replied, her lips curling in something that wasn't quite a smile. The words hung heavy in the cabin. Seat 34E was at the very back of the aircraft, wedged between two seats, directly beside a lavatory. From the polished quiet of first class to the noise and press of the rear. A murmur rippled through the cabin. A man in the row across lowered his newspaper. Another sipped his drink with deliberate slowness, as if to watch the drama unfold without appearing too obvious. Malcolm's heartbeat remained steady, but a dull sting began to form beneath his chest. This was not new. He had felt versions of this sting before in boardrooms, at conferences, in hotels where his presence had been questioned. Yet here it was again, on a plane, wrapped in the language of safety and adjustment. "I see," Malcolm said softly. He gathered his tablet and briefcase with practiced care. He did not argue. He did not protest. Not yet. As he rose to his feet, the room shifted with him. Phones lifted discreetly, passengers pretending to scroll while angling cameras in his direction. Some avoided eye contact entirely. Others stared openly, curiosity etched into their faces. Clara stood by, posture confident, the air of someone who had just corrected a detail in a painting. Malcolm began the long walk down the aisle. The tap of his shoes against the carpet was slow, rhythmic, almost ceremonial. Each row passed him like an audience, silent but attentive. 10 rows, 15, 20. His shoulders squared as whispers followed him, the sting in his chest deepening with every step. At last, he reached the back. Seat 34E was exactly as described, cramped, narrow, sandwiched between two strangers, with the constant hiss of the lavatory door inches away. The overhead bins above were already stuffed, leaving no space for his briefcase. He lowered himself carefully into the seat, folding his long frame awkwardly, his face expressionless. He reached for his seatbelt and clicked it into place. His breath remained steady, but his hand lingered on the armrest, fingers tightening for just a second before releasing. He looked forward, gaze calm. Yet behind his glasses his eyes burned with a quiet storm. And then, from the corner of his vision, he saw movement. Clara Jennings returned to the front, her smile suddenly brighter, her posture lighter. She ushered a man into the cabin, a white man in his late 30s, jacket rumpled, tie askew, his carry-on bag half-zipped. The man looked flustered, out of place. Clara leaned close to him, her tone warm and familiar. "Mr. Dalton, we're so glad you made it. Right this way." She guided him directly to 2A, to Malcolm's seat. The man collapsed into it with a grateful sigh, accepted a glass of champagne without so much as showing his boarding pass, and began chatting amiably with the passenger beside him. Clara beamed as if she had just rescued royalty. Malcolm sat frozen in 34E. He did not speak. He did not rise. He watched as his seat, purchased weeks ago, reserved with care, was given away in less than a minute. No pretense now, no operational necessity, no safety reshuffling, just erasure. Behind him, the restroom door hissed open, then shut, its metallic click echoing like a clock counting seconds. His jaw remained still, his body composed, but his mind shifted, slowly, methodically. Clara Jennings had made a mistake she did not yet understand. The walk to the rear of the aircraft felt longer than it should have. For Dr. Malcolm Harlow. Each step seemed to stretch, elongated by the weight of every curious stare and the subtle glow of smartphones angled just so. The muted hum of first class faded behind him as he crossed the invisible barrier into economy. The air shifted there, warmer, heavier, filled with the chatter of families, the clatter of overhead bins, the impatience of travelers eager to sit. He carried himself with the same upright dignity he always had, but inside he felt a familiar sting, the quiet humiliation that had threaded itself through his life in ways both small and staggering. When he finally reached row 34, a passenger already in the aisle seat sighed loudly, sliding his knees slightly inward with exaggerated reluctance. The man in the window seat glanced up, gave a curt nod, then returned to scrolling on his phone. Malcolm pressed his briefcase into the narrow overhead compartment, fighting against bags stuffed haphazardly, and folded himself into the middle seat. The reality of 34E settled quickly around him. The armrests pinched. The air carried the faint chemical scent of the nearby lavatory. From his left, the man in the aisle cracked open a bag of trail mix, chewing noisily. To his right, the restroom door sighed and clicked each time someone entered or exited, a mechanical rhythm he knew would accompany the entire flight. He buckled his seatbelt and adjusted his posture, keeping his expression neutral. He was no stranger to discomfort. Decades in his field had taught him how to withstand pressure, how to sit in silence when meetings turned cold, how to navigate the 1,000 tiny exclusions that no one ever admitted were exclusions. But this was different. He had not simply been overlooked, he had been removed, reassigned from the seat he had paid for, stripped of the dignity of choice. And then, in the cruelest twist, he had been forced to watch as another man was placed where he had been meant to sit, handed champagne like a prize, while Clara Jennings smiled her perfect, false smile. Malcolm closed his eyes for a moment and breathed deeply. Anger stirred somewhere within, hot and insistent, but he had long ago learned the danger of letting anger take the lead. The world was quick to mislabel it, to weaponize it against men like him. Instead, he sat still. He gathered himself. He waited. The minutes passed. Boarding announcements echoed through the cabin, punctuated by the shuffle of bags and the thud of seats clicking upright. Just as Malcolm reached into his pocket for his noise-canceling earbuds, he heard a soft voice at his side. "Excuse me, is this seat taken?" He turned. Standing in the aisle was a young woman, no more than 25. She carried her blazer folded over one arm, her other hand gripping a small tote bag. She had a slim build, dark skin, and high cheekbones that caught the cabin light. Her expression was polite but weary, the look of someone accustomed to long days and short nights. Malcolm shifted slightly, pulling his briefcase tighter to make room. "It's open," he said. "Thank you." She slid gracefully into the middle seat, tucking her blazer into her lap. After a moment, she extended a hand. "Ava Sinclair. I'm deadheading to Los Angeles for training. First week at SkyReach." Malcolm shook her hand with a firm nod. Malcolm Harlow. Her eyes flickered with recognition. She studied him for a second, then leaned in slightly, her voice lowering. "Dr. Malcolm Harlow. The Malcolm Harlow Aviation Systems." He hesitated, then gave the faintest of smiles. "That's right." Her face lit with awe. "I read your work in grad school. Predictive turbulence modeling, layered safety protocols. You're practically a legend in aviation circles. What are you doing back here? Seat reassignment." Malcolm replied quietly, Apparently, I didn't fit the criteria for 2A. Ava's expression hardened. She didn't ask who had made that call. She already knew. Her eyes drifted briefly toward the front of the plane, where Clara Jennings had vanished behind the curtain of first class. That would be Clara, she muttered, her voice low but firm. You know her? Malcolm asked. I've seen her work, Ava said. During orientation, we're told to observe senior staff, Clara's reputation. Well, it speaks louder than the training manuals. She folded her arms tightly. Malcolm studied her. And what does that reputation say? That this wasn't an accident? Ava's tone was resolute now, the kind of voice that carried the sharp edge of truth. She's done it before, multiple times. I've heard the excuses, weight distribution, operational reshuffling, always the same. But the pattern is impossible to ignore. It's always passengers of color who get reassigned, and always, within minutes, their seats are filled by white passengers. Malcolm's jaw tightened, though he kept his voice calm. How many times 8 that I know of? Maybe more, Ava said. Last month, there was a Haitian-American businessman, quiet, respectful, no issues. He was bumped to a jump seat mid-boarding. They claimed it was a computer error, but I overheard Clara laughing about standard upgrades as she guided someone else into his seat. Was it documented? Malcolm asked. Ava shook her head. Nothing formal. The company discourages reporting incidents like that. There's a culture. They don't scream. They don't argue. They just smile and erase you. Malcolm absorbed her words in silence. The sting in his chest was no longer just personal. It was pattern. It was deliberate. He powered on his tablet again, not to review his keynote slides this time, but to open an encrypted folder. His thumbprint unlocked it. On the screen appeared a file labeled Incident Log Flight 721A. He tapped in the first entry, summarizing what Ava had just told him, cross-referencing federal regulations, noting the specific terms Clara had used. You're building a report, Ava said softly, watching his screen. I'm building a case, Malcolm replied. The plane shuddered gently as it pushed back from the gate. Safety announcements played overhead. Neither Malcolm nor Ava looked up. You know, Ava whispered, leaning closer. If Clara knew who you really were, she'd probably be in the cockpit right now begging the pilot to turn this plane around. Then let's keep it that way, Malcolm said. I'm more useful in silence. She smiled faintly, then reached into her tote bag and pulled out a small notepad, worn at the edges. I've kept my own records, she said. Dates, flight numbers, crew rosters, nothing official, just observations. If you want them, they're yours. Malcolm accepted the notepad with solemn gratitude. They'll help, he said quietly. For the first time since being marched out of 2A, he felt a small measure of reassurance. He was no longer alone. The plane roared as it lifted into the sky, the city lights of Boston shrinking below. In first class, champagne glasses clinked. Behind the curtain, laughter drifted faintly. But in row 34, amid the cramped seats and the hiss of the lavatory door, something else had begun, a quiet resistance. Malcolm sat still, his eyes forward, his posture calm. But behind his glasses, his mind worked quickly, precisely. He knew the system. He knew how to trace patterns, how to build a chain of evidence that could not be denied. And he knew that Clara Jennings had just written herself into a story she could not control. Beside him, Ava Sinclair folded her blazer, straightened in her seat, and gave him a look that was part admiration, part determination. Whatever was coming, they would face it together. The first hour of Flight 721 slipped by in an uneasy rhythm. The cabin lights dimmed to a soft glow, the safety announcements long finished, the quiet drone of engines stretching into the background. Passengers settled into their seats, flipping through movies or adjusting headrests, while flight attendants glided down the aisles with carts rattling faintly. In row 34, however, Dr. Malcolm Harlow sat rigid, his tablet balanced across his knees, his mind already mapping out a chain of events that could not be explained away. Beside him, Ava Sinclair leaned slightly toward the aisle, her expression alert, as though watching Clara Jennings from a distance could somehow slow the older woman's movements. Clara worked with clinical precision, pouring drinks, flashing polite smiles. But her eyes carried the sharpness of someone who was always measuring, always calculating. Malcolm's tablet screen glowed faintly. His fingers moved with practiced ease, recording observations. He logged the incident of his reassignment, noting the false justification of operational adjustment, marking Clara Jennings as the initiating staff member. Then he opened Ava's small notebook, its pages filled with neat handwriting. She had tracked dates, flight numbers, crew names, and passenger descriptions again and again. Malcolm saw the same thread a man or woman of color moved out of a premium seat, always under the same vague pretense, and always followed by the quiet placement of another passenger who fit the right look. It was not coincidence. It was choreography. Malcolm sat back for a moment, pressing two fingers against his temple. He thought about his long career, about the endless reports he had written for the FAA, the NTSB, international conferences. He had taught generations of engineers how to see patterns where others saw randomness, and now, here it was, unfolding not in a lab or on a chart, but in the aisle of a commercial jet. But a voice inside him whispered doubt. What if speaking out led to nothing but retaliation? What if the system was built to absorb complaints, bury them, and move on? He had seen that before. He had been ignored before. A tired part of him wondered if silence would be simpler, if enduring the humiliation would let him reach Los Angeles unscathed. He closed his eyes for a moment and thought of his son, James. Years ago, James had been stopped by security at an airport, questioned harshly for no reason other than the color of his skin. Malcolm had comforted him later, telling him that the best response was calmness, composure, dignity. Yet here he was, asked to swallow the same bitter medicine again. Was composure enough, or was silence just another way of granting permission? When he opened his eyes again, he saw Ava watching him carefully, her brow furrowed. "You're thinking of letting it go, aren't you?" she asked softly. Malcolm's lips curved faintly, a weary smile without joy. "I've let many things go, Ms. Sinclair. Sometimes it seems easier." "But not this," Ava replied, her voice steady. "Not when you already see the pattern. You can't unsee it now. You've taught people how to read the truth in turbulence data. You know what this is." Her words landed with surprising force. Malcolm studied her face, young, determined, perhaps still unweathered by years of compromise. Yet there was fire there, and conviction. For a moment, he felt something he hadn't felt in a long time, the stirrings of responsibility. A sudden movement in the aisle drew their attention. A folded note slipped quietly onto Malcolm's tray table. He looked up to see a woman several rows ahead glance back briefly before returning to her seat. The note was folded twice, the handwriting neat. Saw what happened. I filmed it. Don't let them erase it. Seat 15C. Malcolm's eyes tracked forward. Seat 15C was occupied by a woman in her late 30s, espresso-toned skin, a tailored gray blazer draped across her shoulders. She glanced back again, given the briefest nod before focusing on her tablet. Malcolm recognized the posture immediately, the calm, deliberate bearing of someone who knew the weight of evidence. A lawyer, he guessed, perhaps civil rights, perhaps labor. He slid the note beneath his tablet and typed a quick addition to his log witness testimony. Seat 15C, video footage available, post-landing contact required. Beside him, Ava whispered, "That's Sofia Delgado. I've seen her name before. She represented flight attendants in a harassment case last year. She's credible." Malcolm gave the smallest nod. Another piece of the puzzle, another ally. The aircraft jolted gently as it leveled into smoother air. Malcolm returned to his log, his fingers moving steadily. He documented Ava's testimony, Sophia's note, the observable behavior of Clara Jennings, and the timing of his reassignment. Already, the framework was forming. Not just a complaint, a case. The man in the aisle seat beside him leaned slightly toward Malcolm. He was middle-aged, with graying hair tucked beneath a baseball cap. "Excuse me," he said quietly, voice low. "I couldn't help overhearing earlier. Dr. Harlow, isn't it?" Malcolm turned slightly, wary but attentive. "Yes." The man extended a hand. "Captain Marcus O'Neill. Off duty. I fly for Pacific Skies. I was sitting in row 28 when they moved you." Malcolm shook his hand firmly. "I appreciate your discretion, Captain." Marcus nodded. His eyes were steady, the eyes of a man used to cockpits, used to responsibility. "I've seen plenty of things up in the air, sir. But what happened to you back there that wasn't procedure? And the excuse they gave about safety or weight distribution? It's nonsense. You don't reassign one person in seat 2A for balance on a transcontinental route. It doesn't happen. Not on a plane this size." Malcolm's expression didn't change, but something settled in his chest. Confirmation, validation. "Would you be willing to make a statement? If needed," he asked. "Of course," Marcus said without hesitation. "I'll stand by what I saw." For a moment, silence stretched between them, heavy with unspoken understanding. Then Marcus leaned back into his seat, leaving Malcolm with his thoughts. One witness became two, then three. A pattern no longer whispered but spoken, carried by voices from across the cabin. Malcolm began to see the outlines of something larger than himself. Larger than Clara Jennings's quiet cruelty. It was not simply one seat, one humiliation. It was a culture, a system, a shadow that stretched across more flights, more passengers than anyone dared to count. His tablet screen reflected in his glasses as he typed a new entry. Observation log systemic pattern suggested. Witness reports confirm targeted reassignment practices. Multiple corroborating accounts. Potential violation of federal civil rights protections. He paused for a moment, his fingers hovering. In that silence, the question returned. Should he push further? Should he risk the retaliation he knew would come? He was not a young man anymore. He valued his peace. He had earned his rest. Yet the sting in his chest reminded him that peace without justice was only quiet oppression. Ava leaned closer, her voice a whisper meant for him alone. "If you don't act, no one will. But if you do, maybe everything changes." Her words echoed in him as the cabin lights dimmed further, as the passengers settled into the rhythm of a night flight. The engines droned steadily. The smell of reheated meals drifted faintly through the air, and the voices of strangers became part of a low, indistinct chorus. But for Malcolm Harlow, the night would not be one of rest. He sat, straight-backed, eyes fixed on the screen, the soft glow casting sharp lines across his face. He had spent a lifetime deciphering signals, patterns, algorithms designed to predict turbulence and keep passengers safe. Now, those same instincts told him that turbulence of another kind was building, and he would not let it pass unseen. The hum of the engines had settled into a steady rhythm, a background lullaby that usually coaxed passengers towards sleep. But for Dr. Malcolm Harlow, rest was impossible. His tablet rested on the lowered tray table, its glow casting faint shadows across his lined face. The log he had started earlier now grew steadily, each keystroke another nail in the framework of a case he had not asked to build, but which had been placed in his hands all the same. Beside him, Ava Sinclair adjusted her seat belt as the plane hit a small pocket of turbulence. She did not flinch. Instead, she leaned slightly toward him and whispered, "She's watching you." Malcolm did not need to ask who. He tilted his head slightly, catching a glimpse of Clara Jennings at the far end of the aisle. She was walking slowly now, less like a flight attendant serving passengers and more like a warden surveying a prison block. Her eyes skimmed row after row, then landed briefly on Malcolm before sliding away. The smile she wore was professional, but it did not hide the tightness in her jaw. "She knows something's happening," Ava murmured. "She knows I didn't disappear quietly." Malcolm replied. He lifted his tablet and minimized the log. Then, quietly, he rose from his seat. "Stretch," he murmured to Ava, and she nodded. He moved carefully down the aisle, weaving past passengers lost in movies and meals, until he reached row 15. Sofia Delgado looked up as he approached. Her expression was calm, steady, but her eyes held the spark of someone who had already decided where she stood. Malcolm bent slightly toward her. "You passed me a note," he said quietly. "Yes," Sophia replied, "and I filmed the entire exchange. From the moment she asked for your boarding pass to the moment she seated that man in 2A, I have it on my phone. May I see it?" She nodded, turning her phone slightly so only he could glimpse the screen. The footage was clear Clara's falsely sweet tone, Malcolm's calm protest, the humiliating reassignment, and finally the smiling welcome for the disheveled white man who now reclined in Malcolm's rightful seat. Sophia lowered the phone. "I'm an attorney," she said simply, "civil rights and labor. This isn't the first time I've heard whispers of discrimination in this airline, but video changes everything. They can spin stories, bury reports, discredit witnesses, but film." She held up the phone. "Film is harder to erase." Malcolm exhaled slowly. "Would you be willing to share it formally?" "Yes, with the right authority. I don't trust the airline to handle it internally. They'll bury it, just like they've buried everything else." He studied her for a long moment, then gave a small nod. "Thank you." As he straightened, a voice caught his ear. "Dr. Harlow." He turned. A tall woman in her 50s sat in row 38, just a few rows further back. She wore a simple cardigan, her hair pulled into a low bun streaked with gray. Her face was tired, but her eyes burned with recognition. "Diane Mercer," she said softly. "I used to be a captain with SkyReach." Malcolm moved closer. "Used to be." Her lips tightened. "Not anymore. 3 years ago, I filed an internal complaint against Clara Jennings. I had seen her mistreat passengers repeatedly, always the same way, always of people of color. I thought reporting it would make a difference. What happened, I was reassigned. First to back-to-back red-eye flights, then to the least desirable routes. They called it performance-based rotation. But it was punishment. Within 6 months, I was removed from premium assignments altogether. A year later, they pulled me from command entirely. I was told my team cohesion scores were too low. That was the end of my career. The bitterness in her voice was quiet, almost resigned, but the pain underneath was unmistakable. Malcolm felt his chest tighten. "And Clara promoted." Diane replied, "She's been climbing ever since. She has protection." From whom Diane's gaze hardened. Edward Langford, CEO, and her godfather. The name hung between them like a stone. Malcolm had heard it many times in professional circles. Langford was known as a strategist, ruthless in business, the kind of executive who prided himself on efficiency and optics. If Clara was tied directly to him, this was not simply her arrogance, it was systemic. "Would you testify?" Malcolm asked carefully. Diane gave a hollow laugh. "I lost everything once, but seeing you drag down that aisle today, yes, I'll testify. Someone has to." He inclined his head in respect. "Your voice may be the one that breaks this open." She shook her head. "It should never have taken this long." Malcolm returned slowly to his seat, his mind heavy with the weight of each new revelation. Ava looked at him expectantly as he sat. "Well," she asked. "3 witnesses," he replied softly, "all credible, all with stories that confirm the same pattern, and all willing to stand up." Ava's lips pressed into a firm line. "That's more than a pattern. That's evidence." Malcolm powered his tablet back on. His fingers moved rapidly across the screen, entering testimony, attaching observations, annotating each with federal code citations. The log now stretched into pages: discriminatory reassignment, retaliation against staff, fabricated justifications, corroborating video evidence, credible witnesses. He paused once more, letting his hands fall to his lap. For a moment, silence pressed against him. His mind drifted to memories of long nights in research labs, the hum of machines, the glow of monitors. He had always believed his work would keep passengers safe from turbulence, from faulty equipment, from the cold indifference of physics. He had never expected that he would one day need to protect them from each other, from prejudice disguised as procedure, from cruelty hidden beneath uniforms. He glanced up the aisle toward first class. The curtain swayed faintly, as if stirred by more than air. Behind it, he imagined Clara Jennings sipping water, planning her next move. He wondered if she knew yet how much the tide had turned against her. Ava broke the silence. "You've seen this kind of thing before, haven't you?" "Not here. Maybe, but somewhere." Malcolm's face was still, but his voice carried the weight of years. "I've seen men build entire systems to justify exclusion. I've seen algorithms coded to hide discrimination beneath numbers. I've seen colleagues tell me to let things go for the sake of harmony. And I've stayed silent more times than I care to admit. But silence doesn't erase injustice. It only protects it." Ava looked at him with a mixture of admiration and sorrow. "Then maybe this time, silence ends." He gave a small nod. Maybe it does. The engines droned. The cabin lights dimmed further as the plane settled into cruise. Around them, passengers dozed, headphones in, blankets draped across shoulders. Yet, in row 34, the air felt electric, heavy with the promise of confrontation. Malcolm knew now that the humiliation he had endured was only the beginning. Clara Jennings had not simply reassigned him. She had triggered a reckoning, and as the plane cut westward through the night sky, he resolved that when it landed, the truth would land with it. The cabin had grown hushed, as most passengers slipped into the half-sleep of long flights. Screens flickered faintly in the dark, seatbelt signs glowed, and the engines droned with steady rhythm. But in row 34, the air was anything but calm. Dr. Malcolm Harlow sat upright, tablet resting on his lap, typing with deliberate care. The log was no longer just an account of humiliation. It had become a dossier. His entries detailed not only his reassignment, but the testimonies of Sophia Delgado, Marcus O'Neill, and Diane Mercer. Each story confirmed the same quiet pattern of discrimination. Each voice gave the case new strength. Beside him, Ava Sinclair tilted her head toward the front of the plane. "She's moving again," she whispered. Malcolm looked up. Clara Jennings was gliding down the aisle, her heels clicking softly against the carpet. In her hands, she carried a small black pouch, her expression fixed in the professional calm that had fooled so many. But her eyes betrayed her purpose. She was coming directly for him. She stopped at row 34, her smile perfectly rehearsed. "Mr. Harlow," she said in a tone so smooth it could have been mistaken for kindness. "I'll need to collect your devices." Malcolm lifted his gaze slowly, his voice calm. "Under what regulation company protocol?" Clara replied without missing a beat. "Section 14B, temporary precaution for data security during flight." "There is no Section 14B, Malcolm said evenly. Her smile tightened, but did not break. "Sir, this is standard procedure. I'm going to ask you to hand them over voluntarily. We'll return them once we land." Malcolm's voice carried no hint of anger, only quiet authority. "You are attempting to confiscate federal equipment under the guise of a non-existent policy. That is not precaution. That is obstruction. Around them." Several passengers stirred, eyes flicking curiously toward the exchange. Phones lifted discreetly, catching the moment. Clara's jaw clenched, but her tone remained honeyed. "I'll ask once more." She said, "Your cooperation is appreciated." "No." Malcolm replied simply. The word hung in the air, quiet but immovable. Clara's smile froze for half a second before she turned sharply on her heel, striding back toward the forward galley. Ava exhaled slowly, her shoulders stiff. "She's rattled," she whispered. "Good," Malcolm murmured. "Because I'm not finished." But even as he spoke, the corner of his tablet screen flickered. The secure connection he had established earlier shifted from green to yellow, then red. "Network unavailable. Authentication error." "They're trying to cut you off," Ava said quickly, leaning closer. Malcolm retrieved a small matte black module from the seatback pocket in front of him. It blinked faintly, green but weaker now. "Not trying," he said softly. "They've revoked my device's signature from the crew's internal network. They're targeting me specifically." Ava's eyes widened. "Can they do that?" "Technically, yes. Legally, no." The tablet cycled through alternate connections. Each attempt failed. For a moment, silence pressed heavy against them. Then Malcolm reached calmly into his bag and pulled out a second device, smaller than the first, shaped like a compact cylinder. He twisted its top once. A soft blue light pulsed. Immediately, the tablet reconnected, not through the plane's Wi-Fi, but through a satellite tether routed via an emergency beacon frequency, invisible to the crew, untraceable, new channel active, Malcolm said quietly. Ava's lips curved into the faintest grin. Nice trick, not a trick, Malcolm corrected. Contingency protocol. With renewed focus, he resumed uploading his log entries. Each violation, each testimony, each photograph of safety oversights flowed into a secure FAA server. But now he added one more entry: attempted interference with federal equipment. Subject Clara Jennings. Unauthorized confiscation effort. Targeted network revocation. Minutes later, the intercom crackled to life. Clara's voice rang smooth and calm across the cabin. Ladies and gentlemen, due to updated federal regulations concerning mid-flight data security, photography and video recording are restricted for the remainder of this flight. This is to ensure the safety of our crew and protect passengers from unauthorized surveillance. We appreciate your cooperation. A ripple of murmurs spread through the cabin. Some passengers frowned, confused. Others shrugged and put their phones away, but a handful exchanged glances, suspicion in their eyes. Ava leaned close. That's not real. Is it? No. Malcolm replied softly. It's not. Moments later, Clara reappeared, accompanied by another attendant. Her voice was quieter now, directed solely at him. We've been informed of unauthorized electronic interference aboard this aircraft. For security, I'll need you to power down and surrender your devices. Malcolm turned his head, meeting her gaze with quiet steel. Ms. Jennings, I am operating under full compliance with Federal Aviation Regulation 91.8. I am obligated to report observed violations of passenger treatment and in-flight safety procedures. I am fulfilling my legal responsibility. For the first time, Clara's expression cracked. Her pupils narrowed, her lips pressed thin. She turned sharply and walked back toward the galley, her steps faster now, less graceful. Passengers nearby exchanged hushed whispers. A man across the aisle leaned to his companion. She tried to take his tablet. Another muttered, "That's not procedure." Ava touched Malcolm's arm gently. "She's losing control." Malcolm gave a small nod. "And that makes her dangerous." He sent another encrypted update. Interference attempt escalated. Crew issuing false announcements. Anticipate retaliation. The engines hummed steadily as the aircraft cut through the night sky. Around them, passengers dozed, but beneath that surface calm, a storm had begun to build. Clara Jennings had made her move. She had tried to silence him, and in doing so, she had given him more evidence than he could have hoped for. Malcolm sat back, folding his hands over the tablet. His breathing was slow, controlled. Inside, however, he felt the quiet fire of resolve. He had been humiliated, dismissed, stripped of his dignity in front of strangers. But now, those same strangers were watching Clara. They had heard her lies. They had seen her attempt to erase him. And soon, they would know the truth. Ava's voice was almost a whisper. She doesn't know it yet, but she's already lost. Malcolm turned his gaze forward, toward the curtain that divided economy from first class. She hasn't realized the one mistake she made, he said softly. What mistake? Ava asked. She chose the wrong passenger. The engines roared gently, steady and endless, carrying Flight 721 westward. But for Malcolm Harlow, the course of the flight had already shifted. Clara Jennings's attempt to silence him had only given him the microphone he needed. And this time, he would not put it down. The minutes after Clara's failed attempt to seize Malcolm's devices stretched heavy with tension. She had retreated to the galley, but her shadow seemed to linger, pressing against row 34 like a weight. Ava Sinclair sat rigid, her eyes on him, as if bracing for what she already sensed was coming next. The cabin lights dimmed further. Most passengers appeared settled, lost in films, books, or uneasy rest. Yet under the quiet hum of the engines, the atmosphere carried a new unease. Whispers traveled row to row, passengers murmuring about the announcement Clara had made, about her demand for Malcolm's devices. Some sounded skeptical, others fearful, but no one seemed fully convinced by her words anymore. Then, the intercom crackled. A male voice filled the cabin, calm and steady. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. Due to a minor technical concern, we'll be making a precautionary stop in Phoenix to assess the situation. We appreciate your patience and cooperation. Flight attendants, prepare the cabin for descent." Ava's head snapped toward Malcolm, her expression sharp. "That's not routine," she whispered. "No," Malcolm said, his voice low, steady. "It's retaliation." His mind worked quickly, processing every detail. Clara had failed to strip him of his devices, failed to silence his documentation. Now she was escalating the situation. By framing him as a security risk or by manufacturing a technical excuse, she had convinced the captain to divert the flight, and, once they landed, he would be met not by understanding, but by waiting security agents briefed with her version of events. Ava's voice trembled with anger. "She told him you were dangerous. She's setting you up." Malcolm's jaw tightened, but his composure held. "Then we'll make sure the truth lands before she does." He retrieved his backup tablet, a secondary device reserved for emergency operations, one he had hoped he would never need to use. Its matte surface gleamed faintly in the low light. He powered it on, and the screen lit with a soft red icon pulsing in the corner. Silent alert. Tier 3 protocol available. He selected the option. A prompt appeared, requesting confirmation. Activate Field Protocol 9.7, aircraft safety threat, immediate triage requested. His thumb pressed yes. The screen opened to a secure dialog box. His fingers moved steadily across the keyboard, his voice quiet as he narrated for Ava's benefit. Atlas Air Flight 721 in-flight interference with federal documentation. Suspected abuse of authority by lead attendant, attempted device seizure, unauthorized network revocation. False security announcement issued, diversion in progress under pretense. Request NTSB observation team on ground in Phoenix. He signed the message Deputy Director Malcolm Harlow, National Transportation Safety Board. He pressed send. The signal encrypted, bounced between satellites, tunneled into the NTSB's secure system. Somewhere. A phone buzzed, a duty officer's screen lit, and the wheels of a much larger system began to turn. Ava watched, her hands clasped tightly together. "You just called them in. They'll be waiting on the tarmac," Malcolm said quietly. The plane dipped slightly as it began its descent. Around them, passengers stirred, puzzled. A woman across the aisle asked her neighbor if something was wrong. A man behind them muttered about being late for a connection. Confusion buzzed through the rows like static. Then Clara appeared again, her voice pitched to carry just far enough. "We apologize for the inconvenience," she announced smoothly, pausing by row 34. "One of our guests has unfortunately violated in-flight conduct policies. For everyone's safety, we're making a brief stop to resolve the issue before continuing on." Her eyes flicked toward Malcolm as she spoke. Her smile never faltered. Gasps rippled nearby. A passenger frowned. Wait, what violation? Another leaned into the aisle. "Who are they talking about?" Clara raised her hand gently. "I'm not at liberty to discuss details. Everything is under control." Malcolm remained silent, his hands folded on his lap. Ava leaned close, her voice tight. "She's painting you as a threat." "Yes," he murmured, "but she doesn't know she's already out of control." He tapped the tablet once more, sending an update. "Descent initiated. Public pretext established. Security boarding expected. Request NTSB confirmation." Within minutes, a reply appeared on his screen, encrypted, unmistakable, Field Unit Phoenix. Response confirmed. NTSB observers en route to gate. FAA notified. Whole position. Signed, Inspector Regina Sterling. Malcolm exhaled slowly. Relief flickered across his face, though it was tempered by the storm ahead. "They'll be there," he whispered. The aircraft descended steadily, lights of Phoenix sprawling across the horizon below. Passengers pressed faces to windows, confusion deepening. Why were they landing? What had happened? Rumors buzzed louder now, carried by hushed voices. The wheels touched down with a jolt. Instead of rolling toward the main terminal, the plane veered sharply, taxiing toward a remote section of the tarmac where service vehicles idled. Beyond them, 3 black SUVs rolled into position. Clara's smile was taut now, triumphant. She passed row 34, leaning just close enough for Malcolm to hear. "You'll be escorted from the plane," she whispered, "and you won't be flying anywhere else tonight." Malcolm lifted his gaze to meet hers, his expression calm, his voice steady. "On the contrary, Ms. Jennings, tonight, I am exactly where I am supposed to be." Her face stiffened, her confidence faltering just a fraction. She turned away quickly, striding toward the front of the plane. Moments later, the cabin door opened. Cold desert air rushed in, sharp against the warmth of the cabin. A set of portable stairs rattled into place. Security officers boarded, their navy uniforms crisp, their postures rigid, hands resting near their belts. The lead officer stopped near Malcolm's row. "Sir," he said firmly, "please gather your belongings and come with us. We've been informed of a potential onboard security violation involving unauthorized electronic activity." The passengers around them froze. Whispers rose in a sudden swell. All eyes turned toward Malcolm, the quiet man who had been moved from first class, now the focus of official scrutiny. Phones lifted, cameras clicked. Ava's breath caught. "They're really doing it," she whispered. Malcolm rose slowly, his movements unhurried. He reached into his blazer pocket and withdrew a slim leather case. With deliberate precision, he flipped it open, revealing a badge glinting silver and blue under the cabin lights. "Dr. Malcolm Harlow," he said, his voice carrying across the hushed rows. "Deputy Director, National Transportation Safety Board. This aircraft is under active review." The cabin erupted, gasps, murmurs, the clicking of phones recording every moment. The lead officer froze, his composure slipping. Behind him, Clara's face drained of color. Malcolm's voice remained calm, but the authority in it rang like steel. This flight is now subject to a federal audit pending confirmed violations of operational safety protocols and civil rights protections. No crew member is to leave. No passenger is to be removed. You will await the arrival of NTSB investigators. Clara stepped forward, her voice trembling despite her effort. You can't do this. This isn't procedure. You're overstepping. I am invoking Protocol 2941B. Malcolm replied without hesitation. You're welcome to contest it through the proper channels. Until then, you remain where you are. The officers shifted uncertainly. Stepping back, passengers began clapping, scattered at first, then louder, a rhythm of support that filled the rear of the cabin. Someone said loudly, "He's FAA, he's NTSB." Another voice echoed. They tried to kick off a federal investigator. Phones streamed live. Social media lit up. The world outside the plane began watching. Malcolm stood tall, his badge gleaming. The weight of silence broken at last. Clara Jennings, once the master of control, stood pale and speechless in the aisle, and, as the sound of applause swelled, Malcolm knew the tide had turned. The cabin buzzed with whispers long after Malcolm Harlow revealed his badge, the quiet man who had been humiliated. Stripped of his seat and cast to the back, was now standing in the aisle as Deputy Director of the National Transportation Safety Board. The applause that had begun hesitantly in the rear of the plane had grown, spreading forward row by row until it filled the cabin. Some passengers clapped timidly, others with fierce relief, but together they formed a chorus Clara Jennings could no longer ignore. She stood stiffly near the galley, her arms crossed, her composure fraying. Her smile had vanished, replaced with the pale strain of someone who knew the ground beneath her feet was shifting. The captain had retreated into the cockpit, and for the first time in hours, Clara looked uncertain. The cabin door opened again. A gust of cool desert air swept inside as three figures boarded. They wore dark blue windbreakers with gold-lettered embroidery across the chest, NTSB, Federal Inspector. They moved with purposeful calm, carrying clipboards and tablets, their eyes scanning everything: the crew, the passengers, the equipment, even the positioning of carts and bags. A woman with sharp eyes and a steady presence stepped forward. "Inspector Regina Sterling," she announced, flashing her badge. "Atlas Air Flight 721 is now under active federal audit. All operations are suspended until further notice." The cabin fell into a heavy silence. Passengers leaned into the aisle, phones angled to record. Clara opened her mouth to protest, but Sterling's gaze cut to her before she could form words. "All flight attendants are to remain in place. Do not touch or alter any equipment. Do not speak to passengers unless directly instructed." Clara faltered, her lips pressed into a thin line. Sterling turned to Malcolm, who stood calmly in the aisle. "Deputy Director Harlow," she said, her voice steady. "You initiated a Tier 3 protocol." "I did," Malcolm replied, holding her gaze. "Multiple violations. Safety lapses, falsified justification for passenger reassignment, attempted confiscation of federal equipment, targeted suppression of witness documentation, corroborating testimonies from at least 3 passengers and 1 off-duty pilot." Sterling gave a small nod. "Then we escalate immediately." She signaled to her team. "Begin equipment validation. Passenger interviews first, then crew logs." The inspectors dispersed with quiet efficiency. One crouched by row 30, removing the fire extinguisher and scanning its barcode. "Expired," she said crisply, "6 weeks overdue." Another opened an overhead compartment in the galley, revealing oxygen masks sealed in plastic. 2 of the seals had been tampered with, retaped crudely. A third inspector moved toward the emergency exit row, measuring the space obstructed by crew luggage. Reduced clearance by 18 inches, she reported, violation of federal code. Murmurs rose among the passengers. Some shook their heads in disbelief. Others filmed openly, narrating what they were seeing. Sterling's team worked methodically, documenting every detail. Photos were taken, barcodes scanned, measurements recorded. Clara stood frozen near the cockpit door, her eyes darting between the inspectors and Malcolm. The confident authority she had wielded so easily earlier now crumbled under the weight of federal oversight. An older attendant, a black woman in her 50s, stepped forward hesitantly. Her name tag read Riley. Her voice trembled, but it carried weight. "I need to say something." Sterling turned toward her. "Go ahead." "I've worked here 22 years, Riley said, her eyes fixed on Clara. "I filed an incident alert about her 3 years ago. I thought reporting it through the internal system would be enough, but the report disappeared, and I was pulled from international routes the next quarter." A hush fell over the cabin. Riley's hands shook slightly as she continued. "I didn't think she'd escalate like this. I didn't think she'd be so bold, so public, but she has protection. That's why nothing stuck." "Who protects her?" Sterling asked evenly. Riley's gaze dropped. "Edward Langford, the CEO." The name hung heavy in the air. Some passengers gasped. Others muttered curses under their breath. Sterling noted the statement without hesitation. Retaliation, suppressed complaint, protected conduct. She turned to Clara. "Step aside. You are now subject to individual review." Clara's throat worked, but no words came. Her silence was louder than any denial. Meanwhile, another inspector emerged holding a clipboard. 6 maintenance logs altered. He reported, handwriting inconsistencies, whiteout corrections, fault codes signed off without digital stamps, confirmed forgery. Sterling's expression hardened. "Forgery is criminal." She turned back toward Malcolm. "You logged this, I did. 3 hours ago. Passengers were no longer whispering. They were talking openly now. Outrage spilling into the air. "They put us on this plane with expired equipment," one man exclaimed. A woman near the middle rows shook her head, and they wanted to throw him off for catching it. Phones streamed the scene live. Already, hashtags spread across social platforms. Flight 721, grounded by truth. Malcolm sat back for a moment, his tablet still in his lap. He felt the weight of years pressing on him, but also something new momentum. For so long, silence had allowed prejudice to masquerade as policy, cruelty to wear the mask of procedure. But now, under the fluorescent glow of the cabin, silence was breaking. Ava leaned close, her voice fierce. "You've given them the master key. She can't hide anymore." Malcolm's gaze drifted toward Clara. She stood pale and rigid, her hands clasped tightly in front of her like a child caught in a lie too deep to escape. He held her eyes for a moment, not with triumph, but with the steady clarity of truth. "This was never just about one seat," Malcolm said softly, more to himself than anyone else. "It's about a system." Sterling moved closer. "Deputy Director, we'll need you to remain on board until the team completes Phase 1. After that, you'll lead the briefing." Malcolm gave a small nod. Understood. The inspectors continued their sweep, peeling back layers of neglect and manipulation, and with each discovery, the passengers' disbelief shifted into anger, their sympathy into solidarity. For years, Clara Jennings had wielded quiet power, moving people like pieces on a board, erasing voices with a smile. But tonight, on this plane, under this scrutiny, her power was gone, and in its place, something larger had begun to rise. The cabin had become something more than a flight. It was a courtroom, a stage, and a reckoning all at once. Inspectors moved swiftly up and down the aisle, documenting everything with meticulous detail. The passengers no longer whispered. They openly discussed what they had seen. Phones streamed, messages spread, and the name Malcolm Harlow was no longer a secret shared only among aviation circles. It was becoming a banner of resistance. Yet Malcolm's focus was not on the passengers, nor even Clara, who now sat silent on a jump seat, her hands clasped, her complexion ashen. His eyes were fixed on his tablet. Clara's attempt to disable his connection earlier had backfired. In her effort to blind him, she had exposed a hidden pathway into the airline's internal systems. He leaned forward, his fingers gliding with practiced precision. The screen filled with directories, coded subroutines, and archived logs. It was the digital skeleton of Atlas Air's operations. On the surface, harmless maintenance records, seating manifests, crew assignments, but deeper, buried under layers of encryption, Malcolm found something else. A folder labeled OPE Seat V3.2. His chest tightened. The name meant nothing to the average eye, but to someone like Malcolm, it was a red flag. OPI was corporate shorthand for optimal passenger integration. He opened the folder, and lines of documentation filled the screen. At first glance, it appeared sterile, technical, passenger distribution models, conflict reduction matrices, but the deeper he read, the clearer the truth became. Visual conformity, cabin harmony, premium space integrity. Each phrase was corporate camouflage for something far darker. Algorithms weren't just assigning seats based on efficiency. They were classifying passengers based on appearance, ethnicity, even perceived socioeconomic status. A quiet system of exclusion coded into the very backbone of the airline's technology. Ava leaned in, her voice hushed. "What is it?" Malcolm's lips pressed into a thin line. "They've built a system that decides who looks like they belong." She blinked. "You mean yes?" Malcolm cut in gently. "This isn't just Clara's prejudice. It's institutionalized, automated." He scrolled further. A section labeled Passenger Classification Matrix glowed on the screen. Categories scrolled past HDP High Disruption Probability, NCA Non-Conforming Appearance, PCTR Premium Cabin Tension Risk. Each flag was attached to passenger profiles, often triggered by data points as superficial as last names, travel histories, or even facial scans from check-in kiosks. Ava's face tightened, her eyes narrowing with fury. They coded racism into the system. Malcolm nodded grimly, coded it, trained it, and then gave it to people like Clara to enforce. A chill ran through him as he opened the administrator logs. Each time the system had flagged a passenger, someone had manually approved or overridden the recommendation. He scrolled through the signatures. One name repeated itself often. Jennings, C. Clara Jennings. But then another caught his eye. Langford, E. Edward Langford, the CEO, Malcolm exhaled slowly, the weight of revelation pressing against him. Clara hadn't just been a rogue employee protected by corporate power. She had been the executioner of an executive mandate. Passengers around him noticed the glow of the screen, the intensity in his expression. Taylor Rodriguez, seated in 15C, leaned forward. "What did you find?" Malcolm hesitated. This was evidence too explosive to reveal recklessly, but transparency mattered more than secrecy now. He tilted the tablet slightly so she could see. Taylor's face hardened as she read the words aloud, her voice steady, carrying over the murmur of the cabin. Visual conformity enhancement. Maintain optical harmony in premium spaces. The cabin erupted in murmurs, outrage sharp and unfiltered. Someone muttered, "That's segregation in a suit." Another said bitterly, "We paid for tickets, not to be profiled." Phones tilted closer, recording the screen. Hashtags flared online. Clara stiffened from her seat near the cockpit, her voice breaking for the first time. "That's confidential company data. You have no right, Sterling," the lead inspector cut her off sharply. "Quiet, Ms. Jennings. You've said enough." Malcolm didn't look up. He kept scrolling, searching for the root. At last, he found an approval tag at the bottom of the file. Signed, E. Langford, Executive Authorization, Final Deployment. He read the line twice, then closed his eyes briefly. There it is. What Ava asked. The smoking gun. Malcolm said quietly, "This wasn't her invention. This came from the top." The inspectors gathered quickly as Malcolm transmitted the file to their tablets. Sterling's jaw clenched as she read, "Passenger classification based on appearance. Authorized by Edward Langford himself." She looked to her team. "Document, duplicate, secure. This moves from audit to criminal." Passengers cheered quietly, clapping in solidarity. Some were still in disbelief, shaking their heads, while others filmed the inspectors scrolling through the files, the damning words glowing on their screens. Malcolm sat back, exhaustion beginning to creep into his bones. He had flown on countless planes, seen countless systems, studied countless protocols, but never had he witnessed something so deliberate, so carefully hidden behind language designed to soothe shareholders while erasing dignity. Ava's voice broke into his thoughts. "How long do you think this has been running?" 5 years, Malcolm said without hesitation. Long enough to normalize. Long enough that passengers assumed it was chance, or clerical error, or bad luck. Long enough for silence to seem natural. The weight of it pressed against him. Not just his humiliation, not just the humiliation of the Haitian businessman or the other displaced passengers. This was a machine of exclusion, perfected through repetition, and he had stumbled into it by sitting in seat 2A. He clenched his hands together, steadying himself. They thought they could bury me in row 34. Instead, they unearthed themselves. The inspectors were already coordinating, speaking into secure headsets. One turned to Malcolm. "Deputy Director, do we have authorization to freeze the crew logs and escalate to regional command?" Malcolm gave a single nod. "Yes, effective immediately." Sterling moved toward Clara. "Ms. Jennings, you are relieved of duty. Do not attempt to leave this aircraft. Federal charges are pending." Clara's face flushed, her lips trembling as she finally broke. "I was following orders." Sterling's eyes narrowed. "Then, you'll have a chance to explain that to a federal judge." The cabin was alive with murmurs, but Malcolm's mind was already elsewhere. This wasn't over, not even close. He had evidence, yes. But Edward Langford hadn't built this system to crumble at the first sign of exposure. There would be pressure, denial, settlements, attempts to paint it all as a misunderstanding. He had been in Washington long enough to know how systems defended themselves, but this time, the passengers had seen it too. The phones had streamed it. The files were no longer hidden on encrypted servers. They were copied, transmitted, and archived in government databases. The system couldn't be buried again. Malcolm closed his tablet gently, his reflection faint in the dark glass. His thoughts turned inward. For decades, he had tried to reform from within, writing regulations, pushing audits, filing reports, and yet here he was, on a plane, not in a hearing room, not in an office, watching ordinary people bear witness to what he had been fighting all along. He felt both weary and alive, as though every quiet battle of his career had brought him to this very seat. Ava touched his arm lightly. "You okay?" He nodded once. "I've been preparing for this fight my whole life. I just didn't expect it to start at 30,000 feet. Outside, the desert sky burned with the last traces of twilight. Inside, truth burned brighter. The cabin had settled into a strange quiet, not calm, but charged, like the heavy stillness before a thunderstorm breaks. Passengers sat wide-eyed, phones still in their hands, their faces lit by blue screens streaming the drama to the world. Inspectors continued their sweep with clinical precision, and Clara Jennings remained isolated in a jump seat, her head bent, the proud authority she once wielded reduced to silence. Malcolm Harlow sat in the aisle seat, his tablet resting across his knees, glowing with lines of code and archived logs that exposed a system far darker than any single act of discrimination. He had gathered enough to trigger a federal reckoning: tampered equipment, falsified records, discriminatory algorithms signed at the executive level. Yet he knew exposure was only the first step. Systems like this didn't collapse quietly. They fought back. His thoughts were interrupted by a sharp vibration in his pocket. He reached inside and withdrew a slim black phone, one issued only for secure federal communications. The screen displayed a single word: private. Malcolm's chest tightened. He knew before answering who it would be. He pressed the green icon and lifted the phone to his ear. "Dr. Harlow," came the voice on the other end, smooth, commanding, practiced. "This is Edward Langford, the CEO of Atlas Air, the architect behind the algorithm, the man whose signature had approved OPI seat V312. Malcolm's voice remained calm. "I was expecting your call. I imagine you were," Langford said lightly, as though they were two old acquaintances discussing weather. "I'd like to believe we can resolve this matter civilly." Malcolm glanced around the cabin. Ava Sinclair leaned in closer, her eyes sharp with curiosity. Across the aisle, Taylor Rodriguez lifted her phone discreetly. "Recording audio." Malcolm tapped a small icon on his tablet, activating a second layer of recording. "What exactly do you mean by resolve?" Malcolm asked. "I understand you've accessed certain internal materials," Langford replied smoothly. "Files that can easily be misinterpreted without the proper context. I'd hate to see your reputation entangled in something so politically charged." "That's not an explanation," Malcolm said flatly. "That's a deflection." A pause. Langford chuckled softly, though there was no warmth in it. "You're a reasonable man, Dr. Harlow. You've spent decades inside the system. You know how messy these things get once the press sinks their teeth in. Nobody wins, not you, not me, not the industry. The smart play is to let us handle it quietly. Internal review, no headlines, no subpoenas. Malcolm's fingers tightened against the edge of his tablet. What you're describing is a cover-up. What I'm describing, Langford said smoothly, is an exit strategy. For you as much as for us. His tone shifted, heavier now, carrying the weight of threat disguised as courtesy. I know how these spectacles unfold. One day, you're a hero. The next, you're a scapegoat. The media chews through reputations. Do you really want to be dragged through that fire? Because make no mistake, they'll burn you too. Malcolm took a slow breath. His mind flicked to the faces around him, Ava's resolute gaze, Taylor's watchful eyes, the passengers who had already shifted from skepticism to solidarity. They weren't passive anymore. They had witnessed too much. Mr. Langford, Malcolm said, his voice low, steady, deliberate. You made your mistake 5 years ago when you turned human dignity into a line of code. The pause on the other end was longer this time. The smooth veneer in Langford's voice thinned. Be careful. Doctor, you don't know the forces you're challenging. Oh, I know, Malcolm replied. I've spent a lifetime studying them. But here's what you don't know. You've already lost control. This isn't just about me anymore. It's about everyone on this plane. Everyone watching right now. Across the cabin. Someone held up a phone streaming live. Comments scrolled in rapid succession messages of outrage, solidarity, disbelief. Malcolm knew Langford could see the numbers, the trending hashtags, the thousands of eyes locked on Flight 721. You think you're bigger than us. Langford's voice sharpened now, no longer a velvet threat but cold steel. You think a single flight can dismantle a system we've built for years. Malcolm's jaw tightened. No, he said, but it can start. He ended the call before Langford could reply. For a moment, silence pressed against him, heavy and absolute. Then Ava exhaled sharply beside him. You just slammed the door on the most powerful man in aviation. No, Malcolm said, his voice quiet. I opened it. The inspectors returned, their expressions grim but focused. Sterling approached with a tablet in hand. Deputy Director, we've secured the logs. Multiple confirmations. This is no longer an audit. It's a criminal investigation. We'll escort the crew off separately, under federal custody. Passengers will be interviewed before deboarding. Malcolm gave a single nod, the weariness in his eyes tempered by resolve. As the inspectors moved to secure the crew, Clara Jennings suddenly spoke, her voice raw, desperate. I was following orders, she said again, louder this time. Her eyes darted around the cabin, pleading now rather than commanding. You don't understand. I didn't have a choice. Passengers turned, their faces hard with disdain. Riley, the older attendant who had spoken earlier, shook her head. You always had a choice. Clara, you chose wrong every time. Clara flinched, her eyes falling to the floor. For years, she had hidden behind the shield of authority, the armor of corporate protection. But under the sterile light of accountability, she was just another cog in a machine now collapsing under its own weight. Malcolm's mind, however, was already beyond Clara. He could see the larger fight stretching ahead: hearings, lawsuits, reforms. This wasn't about punishing one attendant or even one airline. It was about dismantling an ideology dressed as efficiency, exposing a culture that had decided appearances mattered more than people. He leaned back, closing his eyes briefly. For years, he'd tried to fight from within audits, reports, closed-door meetings that ended in polite dismissals. And yet, here, 30,000 feet above the desert, on a flight diverted under false pretenses, the truth had surfaced in a way no boardroom could smother. The intercom crackled once more. Sterling's voice rang through the cabin. "Ladies and gentlemen, please remain seated. This aircraft is now under federal command. We will be concluding our inspection shortly, and you will be directed through secure channels. Thank you for your patience." Passengers clapped again, louder this time, not hesitant but certain. The sound filled the cabin, bouncing off every panel, every seat, every memory of humiliation that had been turned into defiance. Malcolm opened his eyes. Ava leaned closer, her voice almost a whisper. "You know, this is only the beginning, right?" "Yes," Malcolm said softly. His voice carried not dread but conviction. "And I'm ready." Outside the windows, the desert night stretched vast and endless. Inside, a system was unraveling, thread by thread, under the watchful eyes of those it had tried to erase. And Malcolm Harlow, once humiliated in seat 34E, now stood at the center of a movement no diversion could contain. The descent into Denver felt heavier than the air outside, as if gravity itself had thickened to meet the weight of everything revealed inside the cabin. Passengers sat stiff in their seats, eyes darting between the inspectors. Malcolm Harlow and the pale figure of Clara Jennings, who stared blankly at the floor, her authority shattered. The intercom had gone silent, but the atmosphere hummed with expectation. Malcolm sat calm, though his pulse thudded beneath the surface. His hands rested on his knees, but his mind was already running ahead. He had the evidence secured, witnesses aligned, and a corporation's darkest secret exposed. Yet he knew the real storm was waiting on the ground. Inside the plane he held control. Outside, the machine of power, lawyers, and media spin would already be working to bury him. The captain's voice finally returned, shaky but professional. "Ladies and gentlemen, we'll be making a short stop here in Denver for inspection procedures. Please remain seated until directed." The wheels touched down with a jolt, rubber biting into concrete. Passengers exhaled collectively, some murmuring prayers, others clutching phones tighter. Instead of taxiing to the main terminal, the plane veered off to the far end of the runway, where floodlights illuminated a secure corner of the tarmac. A cluster of vehicles waited black SUVs, federal vans, and at least half a dozen news trucks with satellite dishes pointed toward the sky. Phones buzzed in unison across the cabin. Social media feeds were exploding. Passengers showed one another live news updates. Atlas Air Flight diverted amid federal investigation. Whistleblower on board. Passengers streaming incident live. Malcolm's name had already surfaced in headlines. Some stories painted him as a hero, others as a federal enforcer. He knew both narratives would collide outside those doors. The cabin door opened with a hiss. Cold night air swept inside, carrying the faint smell of jet fuel and damp asphalt. Federal officers stepped aboard, their presence calm but unyielding. Sterling, the lead inspector, moved to the front, her voice carrying authority. "Ladies and gentlemen, this aircraft is under federal hold. You will be deplaned in groups for individual statements. Please have your IDs ready. Your cooperation ensures a lawful and transparent process." Passengers nodded, weary but supportive. No one protested. They had seen too much to doubt the seriousness now. Clara Jennings was the first escorted off. Her wrists were not bound, but the sight of 2 federal agents flanking her was enough to tell the story. Murmurs followed her down the aisle. Not sympathetic, but condemning. She didn't meet anyone's eyes. She had spent years commanding cabins with a smile that erased people quietly. Now, she left the plane as silent as those she had erased. Malcolm remained seated until Sterling approached. Deputy Director. "The press is waiting," she said softly, almost as though apologizing. "I assumed they would be," Malcolm replied, standing slowly. His legs ached, but his spine remained straight. "Let's not keep them waiting." As he moved toward the front, passengers reached out not to stop him, but to touch his arm briefly, to murmur thank yous, to nod with respect. It wasn't fanfare, but it was solidarity. Ava walked beside him, her expression proud yet worried. Taylor followed close, her phone still recording, determined to preserve the truth no matter how the media spun it. The stairs clanged beneath his shoes as Malcolm descended into the floodlights. Cameras clicked instantly, a barrage of flashes illuminating his face. Reporters shouted over one another, their voices a jumble of demands. "Dr. Harlow, were you targeted because of your race? Is Atlas Air using discriminatory algorithms? Are you grounding the airline tonight? Will the CEO face charges?" The questions came like blows, each one sharp, each one hungry. For a brief moment, Malcolm felt the temptation to retreat, to let the inspectors handle it, to avoid becoming the story himself. But then he remembered the folded note slipped under his tray table, the whispered testimonies, the faces of those erased and silenced long before him. He couldn't retreat, not now. He stepped to the portable podium set up near the SUVs, adjusted the microphone, and looked directly into the sea of cameras. His voice was steady, deliberate, carrying into the night. "My name is Dr. Malcolm Harlow. I serve as Deputy Director of the National Transportation Safety Board. Tonight, what began as a personal humiliation has revealed something far larger. This flight exposed systemic violations of safety, integrity, and human dignity." The crowd hushed. Reporters lowered their voices, pens poised, cameras live. In the course of one flight, Malcolm continued, "We uncovered expired safety equipment, falsified maintenance records, and retaliatory crew practices. More critically, we discovered the existence of a system designed to quietly remove passengers deemed non-conforming to premium cabin standards. This system did not emerge by accident. It was authorized and deployed at the executive level." Gasps rippled across the press line. Microphones stretched forward. Malcolm clicked a remote. Behind him, a portable screen lit up, displaying the document. Ava had helped him uncover the training manual with the coded language: maintain optical harmony, preserve brand integrity, visual conformity enhancement. "This," Malcolm said firmly, "is discrimination coded into policy. It is prejudice written into procedure, and it ends tonight." Reporters shouted again, the questions louder, more frantic. Malcolm held up his hand. Silence in them. "I will not speculate on legal outcomes. That will be decided by the courts. What I will say is this: the skies belong to everyone, not just to those who look the part. Equity is not an optional accessory in aviation. It is the foundation of safety and trust." The crowd erupted in more questions, but Malcolm stepped back, signaling the briefing was over. His words would echo louder than anything more he could say in that moment. Sterling guided him toward the waiting SUV, but Ava caught his arm. "You just lit a fire that won't go out," she said. Malcolm gave a tired smile. "Then let it burn." As they drove from the tarmac, Malcolm watched the floodlights recede, his reflection faint in the SUV window. He thought of the passengers still giving their statements, of Riley, the veteran attendant, of Taylor's determined face, of the quiet boy he had once been sitting in the back of classrooms where people underestimated him. Tonight wasn't victory. It was ignition. And he knew the battles ahead would be fiercer than anything on this plane. But, for the first time in years, he felt something he had almost forgotten hope carried not just by him, but by everyone who had seen the truth with their own eyes. The plane remained on the tarmac, engines cooling, its cabin now a frozen crime scene. Inside, federal inspectors photographed every detail, sealed every compartment, and logged every piece of evidence. The corporate shield of Atlas Air had cracked, and through it poured the light of accountability. Malcolm leaned back against the seat, closed his eyes, and whispered to himself, this was only the beginning. 1 week later, the marble steps of the United States Capitol gleamed under the pale morning sun. The building seemed to loom higher than ever, its white columns stark against the blue sky. A line of cameras stretched down the steps, reporters calling Malcolm Harlow's name as he approached the entrance. He walked slowly, his navy suit pressed, his briefcase tucked under one arm. Ava Sinclair walked a step behind him, her trainee's badge now pinned proudly to her jacket. Taylor Rodriguez carried folders of statements from passengers, and just behind them, Captain Layla Monroe, once silenced. Now, standing tall again, strode with a quiet confidence. They were no longer passengers or bystanders. They were witnesses, advocates, allies. Inside, the Senate hearing chamber buzzed with anticipation. Journalists lined the walls, their pens poised. Television cameras turned to catch every movement. Senators filled the semicircle of leather chairs, their expressions ranging from solemn to curious to predatory. At the center sat Senator Gloria Hernandez, chair of the Transportation Committee. Her dark eyes swept the chamber as she adjusted her microphone. "We are here today," she began, "to investigate not only the violations uncovered aboard Atlas Air Flight 721, but the deeper systemic failures, both technological and ethical, that made them possible." She turned toward Malcolm. "Dr. Harlow, you may begin." Malcolm rose, adjusted his glasses, and stepped to the microphone. His voice was calm, steady, carrying through the room, "Madam Chair, members of the committee, thank you." What occurred aboard Flight 721 was not an isolated error, nor a misunderstanding. It was the exposure of a system deliberately designed to profile, exclude, and erase. He opened his briefcase, pulling out a stack of documents and a tablet. "We documented expired safety equipment, falsified maintenance logs, and retaliatory crew practices. But the most alarming discovery was an algorithm OPI seat V3.2 approved at the executive level. This system categorized passengers into risk flags such as non-conforming appearance and premium cabin tension risk. In plain terms, it reassigned passengers based on race, ethnicity, and perceived social status." Gasps rippled through the chamber. Malcolm tapped his tablet, and the screen beside him lit up with the training document Ava had uncovered, "Maintain optical harmony in premium spaces." First class is the face of the brand. Preserve its integrity. Those words, Malcolm said quietly, were not the invention of a rogue employee. They were written into official training materials. They were policy. Senator Marcus Lee leaned forward, his voice sharp. "Dr. Harlow, are you stating under oath that discriminatory behavior was not incidental, but institutionalized?" "Yes." "Senator," Malcolm replied without hesitation, "systemic, deliberate, and approved at the highest levels of leadership." The room grew tense. Reporters scribbled furiously. Then Senator Hernandez lifted a single sheet of paper handed to her by an aide. She studied it for a long moment, her brow furrowing, before looking up. "Dr. Harlow, are you aware of an internal communication dated 2 years ago sent from Edward Langford to the Atlas Air Executive Strategy Team?" Malcolm shook his head. "No, ma'am. Allow me to read it into the record." Hernandez's voice was sharp, unyielding. Quote, "If we keep allowing people like Harlow into premium cabins, we'll lose the brand edge. People like him belong in the shuttle bus, not the headline photo. Manage accordingly." End quote. The chamber froze. A sharp gasp swept through the room. Reporters' fingers flew across keyboards. Cameras zoomed in on Malcolm's face, but he didn't flinch. Ava's hands curled into fists at her sides. Taylor covered her mouth in shock. Layla Monroe's eyes closed briefly, as though she had been waiting for this confirmation all along. Senator Lee slammed a hand against his desk. "This is filth." Hernandez's gaze remained on Malcolm. This email was provided by a whistleblower from Atlas Air's legal division. It has been authenticated by 3 independent analysts. Malcolm inhaled slowly. The words didn't surprise him. He had felt their intent long before he ever saw them. But hearing them spoken aloud, broadcast across the nation, turned the silent prejudice he had endured into a permanent, documented truth. "Madam Chair," Malcolm said quietly, "that message is not just about me. It is about every passenger who has ever been deemed unworthy of dignity because of how they look. It is about an industry that believed image mattered more than justice. And it is about a culture that would rather bury complaints than face accountability." The room was silent except for the faint clicking of cameras. Hernandez nodded. "Dr. Harlow, we would like you to chair a working group to draft a legislative response. We are calling it the Harlow Protocol. Its task will be to ensure that no algorithm, no executive, and no uniform can override dignity." For the first time, Malcolm's composure nearly broke. He blinked slowly, steadying himself, before answering. "I accept." Over the following weeks, the working group took shape. Malcolm met daily with Senate aides, aviation experts, civil rights attorneys, and engineers. Ava was appointed as liaison for flight crews. Layla Monroe provided testimony of the retaliatory culture that had driven her from the cockpit. Taylor Rodriguez organized passenger accounts from dozens of flights where similar reassignments had occurred. Piece by piece, they built the Harlow Protocol mandatory transparency and seating algorithms, whistleblower protections with direct channels to the Department of Transportation, third-party audits of crew logs with penalties for falsification, an expanded passenger Bill of Rights, protecting against discriminatory reassignment, and federal oversight of airline branding policies to prevent image-based profiling. When the bill reached the Senate floor 6 weeks later, the chamber was packed. Reporters filled the gallery. Malcolm sat in the upper balcony beside Ava, Taylor, and Layla, his hands clasped tightly, his jaw set, though his heart thudded with anticipation. The tally appeared on the screen Whitaker Protocol, renamed by amendment to Harlow Protocol. Yes, 100. No, 0. Unanimous. The chamber erupted in applause. Senators shook hands across party lines. Reporters rushed to the phones. Ava gripped Malcolm's hand tightly, her voice breaking. "You did it." Malcolm shook his head softly. "No, we did." That night, long after the vote. Malcolm walked alone through the Capitol Rotunda. He stopped beneath the mural of the Wright brothers' first flight, looking up at the painted canvas. Flight had always symbolized freedom, possibility, ascent, and now, finally, it symbolized equity. He thought of the boy he once was, standing at an airport gate, watching white travelers ushered into premium cabins while his family was told to wait. He thought of seat 34E, the humiliation Clara Jennings had tried to bury him with, and he thought of the voices that had risen beside him, Ava, Taylor, Layla, Riley, the passengers who clapped in defiance. The Harlow Protocol would not erase history, but it would shape the future. And, for the first time, Malcolm allowed himself to believe that when passengers boarded a plane tomorrow, the only thing determining their seat would be the ticket in their hand, not the color of their skin. 1 year later, the airport terminal in Washington, DOC buzzed with a different kind of energy. Screens displayed headlines not about scandals, but about progress. Harlow Protocol marks first anniversary. Airlines worldwide adopt equity standards. Atlas Air assets liquidated after criminal convictions. The once proud company that had dominated the skies for decades was now a cautionary tale. Its logo stripped from gates. Its name reduced to a case study in corruption. Dr. Malcolm Harlow walked through the terminal slowly, a slim leather briefcase in hand. He looked older, perhaps, but stronger too. His presence marked not just by dignity but by quiet recognition. Passengers glanced at him, some whispering, others offering grateful smiles. A young woman in a Delta uniform stopped him briefly, her eyes bright. "Sir, I studied your hearings in training. Thank you. You made it possible for me to believe I belong here." Malcolm gave a small nod, warmth in his eyes. "You do belong here. Always have." At the gate, the sign above the jet bridge read, "Equijet Flight 417 nonstop to San Francisco." The name alone carried weight. Equijet, one of several new carriers born in the aftermath of the Harlow Protocol, prided itself on equity as much as efficiency. Its livery bore no corporate gloss of superiority, just a simple motto painted near the cockpit: "The sky belongs to everyone." The gate agent scanned his boarding pass and smiled. "Welcome aboard, Dr. Harlow." As Malcolm stepped onto the jet bridge, memories washed over him. The sound of Clara Jennings' voice telling him to move, the hush of passengers watching him walk to 34E, the humiliation of the back row, but also the applause that had followed when he revealed his badge, the look in Ava's eyes when the Senate passed the protocol unanimously. The small boy who had once asked him if he was scared, he had been, but staying silent had been scarier. Inside the plane, the difference was immediate. The crew greeted him warmly, their faces a reflection of the world, different shades, different ages, different stories, all working together without hierarchy of worth. At the forward galley, a black male flight attendant and a Latina junior purser laughed softly with an older white crew chief. Inclusion wasn't a performance here. It was the culture. From the cockpit emerged the captain, a woman in her late 40s with sharp eyes and calm presence. "Dr. Harlow," she asked, extending a hand. "I'm Captain May Nakamura. We met once in Seattle, at an aviation ethics conference. You spoke about blind spots in cockpit communication protocols." Malcolm smiled faintly, shaking her hand. "I remember. You challenged the panel more than anyone. And you challenged me," Nakamura said, grinning. "You made me want to stay in command. Thank you." She returned to the cockpit, leaving him momentarily speechless. He found his seat 1A, first class. A card rested on the tray table, his name stitched discreetly in silver, beside a cup of green tea. He placed his briefcase beneath the seat and settled in, the hum of the engines already vibrating through the cabin floor. Across the aisle, a boy of about 10 tugged at his mother's sleeve, then leaned toward Malcolm shyly. "Excuse me, sir, are you the man from the videos?" Malcolm raised an eyebrow, amused. "That depends. Which videos?" "The ones they showed us in school," the boy said earnestly, "about how planes used to treat people unfair. But you made them stop?" Malcolm chuckled softly. "I helped start something. A lot of people made it stop." The boy grinned wide. "My grandpa says you were the first person to ever make a plane land just to tell the truth." His mother hushed him gently, embarrassed, but Malcolm only smiled. "That's one way to put it," he said kindly. "Were you scared?" the boy asked. Malcolm's gaze drifted to the window, to the tarmac busy with luggage carts and fuel trucks. He thought of Denver, of the cold air rushing into the cabin when the door opened, of Bethany Jennings's smug smile collapsing into shock, of Edward Langford's threats over the phone, of the world's eyes turning on him in one instant. "Yes," Malcolm admitted, but it felt worse to stay silent. The boy nodded solemnly, as though he understood something older than his years. His mother mouthed a quiet, "Thank you." Malcolm inclined his head gently. The seatbelt sign chimed. Passengers settled in as the safety video began. But this time, it wasn't a monotone lecture from uniformed faces. Crew members of every background appeared, speaking in multiple languages, signing in ASL, smiling not with rehearsed plastic but with authenticity. It was seamless, inclusive, profoundly human. The plane taxied, engines roaring, and lifted into the sky with a grace that felt different now, not just ascent, but transformation. As clouds drifted below, Malcolm reached into his briefcase and pulled out a small velvet case. Inside was a boarding pass, weathered and creased, Atlas Air 721 seat 34E. Beneath it, Ava's handwriting read, "The seat where everything changed." He stared at it for a long moment, not with bitterness, but with clarity. That seat had been meant to erase him. Instead, it had become his podium. He closed the case and set it aside. The boy across the aisle leaned close again. "So now the sky belongs to everybody." Malcolm smiled. "Yes, now it does." Outside the window, the horizon stretched endlessly, no longer divided by status or illusion. For the first time, Malcolm believed the sky was wide enough for everyone, and with that quiet certainty, he leaned back in his seat, the engines carrying him forward not just through air, but into a future he had helped to build. As the engines cooled and the scandal unfolded, one truth rose higher than the clouds: dignity cannot be reassigned. Dr. Malcolm Harlow's humiliation in seat 34E became more than a personal wound. It became a spark that lit the way for change. From whispered testimonies in the back of a plane to a unanimous vote on the Senate floor, his fight revealed something deeper than algorithms or policies. It exposed the cost of silence and the power of one voice refusing to bow, and maybe that's the lesson for all of us. Discrimination often hides in small moments, in a smirk, a reassignment, a quiet erasure, but when those moments are exposed, when they're met with courage, the system has no choice but to bend. One man's seat became everyone's sky, and today, when passengers board a plane, they do so knowing equity is not a privilege, it's a right. But the work isn't finished. The question is, who will speak up the next time dignity is on the line? If this story moved you, please like, share, and subscribe. Together, we can make sure no one ever gets pushed to the back of the plane again.